The panel today is going to bring us back to reality and say, that's not happening at all. In fact, the gig economy is a vehicle for human liberation that's going to make us all better off, or maybe more subtle things that I'm likely to say. So what is next in the gig economy is our title, and we have 4 wonderful panelists here. Mike Bishop is co-president of Ipsy US currently. He has a long and illustrious history. He's a serial entrepreneur. He was in the Michigan House of Representatives. He was in the Michigan State Senate as majority leader, and he was in the United States Congress as a representative of Michigan's 8th District. He's also a highly successful lawyer and serial entrepreneur. So we were super excited to have Mike Bishop here. Lindsey Cameron is a professor of management at the Wharton School. She has a long and illustrious history in the intelligence community, but if I tell you any more, I will not survive the night. So I'm just gonna leave it at that and say, she's got a lot of places and a lot of interesting things, and that's it. I'm quitting at that point. Thank you for your service. Carrie Leana is the George H. Love Professor of Organizations and Management at the University of Pittsburgh. She's an incredibly widely published and prolific author. She's a professor in the management school, the medical school, the School of International Policy and Public Policy, serves on a bunch of boards, and is also an incredibly prolific and beloved academic. And Azariah Lehman is the Chief Administrative Officer of iWorker Innovations, which you're going to hear from. She's also a very experienced educator and coach, has a lot of real-world experience to bring to bear on this panel. So welcome our panelists, and we're going to go from left to right, from Lindsey to Azariah.
Thank you for that introduction, Jerry. Jerry's always a hard act to follow. You know, I don't feel like I'm as funny as Jerry, nor as I am dark or dystopian as well. So Jerry charged us to think about sort of what are 3 sort of novel or interesting things we could say about the gig economy or about our research. In addition to working for the Intel community, I was also an Uber driver on and off for 3 years. So a lot of my insights come from this grounded experience, as well as I followed 100 drivers for 3 years at that same time. So I have a really sort of longitudinal view of what's been happening in that type of work. And a lot of questions you get is like, is the gig economy really new? Like, wasn't there always gig work, like actors and babysitters, and that's where the word gig comes from. And you know, a lot of academics argue that before there was this thing called employment, there was actually gig work. So gig work is like the original form of employment. And so I'm going to share a little bit of why I think what we're seeing now, I actually call it the on-demand work or the on-demand economy, because, you know, academics like to be precise. Why is what we're seeing today is sort of a new phase, is different. And I really feel like this economy or this type of work packs a punch that's above its weight class. In other words, it has an outsized impact beyond the number of people that it employs. So like the number of folks who are in this term that's called alternative work arrangements, which includes people who work for these platforms, but also like contractors, people with temp agencies, substitute teachers, anybody that's sort of in non-standard W-2 employment, it's roughly only between 10 to 12% if you sort of, so there's arguments about whether or not it's undercounted, but I mean, it's definitely not more than 20% of the workforce. But there's about 40% of Americans who earn something, like they supplement parts of their income from doing this work. You know, maybe you babysit, maybe you do freelance editing, maybe you're a driver on the weekend for one of these services. And of course, most Americans especially have heard of this gig economy or digital work, or these digital on-demand work. Like 97% of people have heard about the ride-hailing industry. So really, because it's consumer facing, I think this gig work has become in our face much more than historic types of gig work have been. So specifically, why do I think these gig companies pack well above their weight? I think it's because they're consumer-facing platforms, which raises their public profile. So you guys have probably seen what's happening in California with the AB5 law. It's considered one of the biggest biggest sort of advances in labor law in the past 40 years. And it's about the reclassification of workers. So types of work that used to be considered independent contracting, they could consider if the organization is actually having control control over the workers, i.e. saying what time they need to show up, setting their wages themselves, basically treating them really like employees, but trying to save on employment taxes by having them be labeled as independent contractors. This California AB 5 law is saying no more. Like, these people need to be properly classified. And that has really big implications for the organizations, but also for workers themselves, because they can get these protections. And I mean, a lot of this independent contract work was considered, it was sort of regulated out of labor laws during the, in the time of the Great Deal and sort of in the New Deal era, because a lot of that work was done, like domestic work, agricultural work was done by minorities, it was done by women, so it wasn't properly protected by labor law, hence it got this term contract labor. And so what these laws do, like what's happening in California, this AB 5 law, it's come about because there's all this pressure about Uber and Lyft and all the algorithms really controlling their workers or not, but the law is having an effect on contract work in generally, not just digital on-demand work. So that's sort of the big idea about why this type of work is sort of is in your face. It's bringing forth a lot of conversations around labor law that have previously been ignored for the past 50 or 60 years for different groups. Another reason why this type of work sort of has, I feel like it punches above its weight class is essentially it's a disruptor. It's sort of this very tangible example of how technology is changing the way we're doing jobs. There's this whole fear around the robots are going to take our jobs. Are they going to take our jobs or are they not? And here you can see with the ride-hailing industry, we've gone from looking at an occupation, like taxi driver was an occupation. It was something that many first-generation immigrants to our country sort of came and did, and it became their career. And most Uber drivers are not seeing it for something they're going to do for the next 30 or 40 years. So it's a sort of very tangible example that can sort of maybe even rise up, bring up some fear from people. Like, is this what the future of work is going to be, or is it not? So to that larger question about are robots going to take our job or not, a lot of there's academic theory out there. It's called technical continuity or technical discontinuity theory, which ultimately says no. Like, robots will sort of de-skill work. Some jobs will be lost, but then there'll be new jobs that'll be created because you need the person who's going to write the algorithm. It's a job we've never seen before, and so people ultimately the workforce will all find jobs. You can think back when the car came into being, and folks were worried that like stablesmen and blacksmiths were sort of going to go away as a profession, and they definitely were reduced, but then you had all these new types of car-related jobs. So I think basically that's why ride-hailing, I think, is sort of really big into people's mind, because it's a representation of the fear of what's going to be happening to work, and then broadly it's sort of creating all these sort of legal conversations around labor laws and independent contractors. So we're going into more specifically about my research around ride-hailing. Maybe some myth busting is what I'm going to talk about next. So anytime I tell folks that I'm studying the ride-hailing industry, I always get a story about, well, I had an Uber driver once that was like an engineer who wanted to improve his public speaking skills so he could be a manager. And so he picked me up in a Maserati, and yeah, this was my Uber driver. Or, this guy's a surgeon, but he has a lot of energy. So like he wakes up really early and, maybe he gives me a ride. Like, I have all these stories, and I believe that they are true. I mean, I interviewed a pilot in my, my sample of 100 drivers, but that's not the majority. That's not how the actual majority of work doesn't get done. So the way I see these platforms is I see it as an example of an 80-20 rule. That 80% of the work on the platform is done by only 20% of the drivers. So the stories that stand out to you are these sort of people who don't fit, this pilot, this surgeon, this engineer, but most of these folks are doing this full time and trying to make, earnings is becoming a significant part of their income. So even if it's not 100% of their income, they're actually dependent on that income. And I think we just, by remembering these stories of sort of these interesting characters, we're sort of shortchanging the folks who are actually doing this work that's really hard and demanding work. And I think it's easy for us to tell a story, especially when these wages are so low, or the cost that we're paying for rides are so low, that this is supplemental income. And that's another myth I want to bust, because this is not supplemental income. Out of these 100 people that I followed, only one person was kind of even doing it for supplemental reasons. She was a stay-at-home mother who's kid had gone to college and she was trying to get financial independence from her husband. I mean, even if these people are working 3 to 4 jobs, you know, the money is used to pay a utility bill, it's used to pay child support, things that are sort of non-negotiable and not supplemental. So another myth to bust. You also hear drivers say, or stories I also hear when I tell people this is the research I do, they say, well, I saw a driver who made $70,000, $80,000 a year. They're making $50 to $75 an hour. That is true. Like I have financial diaries from my drivers. I have seen their W-2s. I have seen drivers that are making like 90, 110. That is not the average. They're in cities usually where there's New York City that has all these special fees and wage protections that bump up the wages. And that's just not the truth. It's what we want to remember, but it's not like, it is the truth, but it's sort of not the average worker's experience. And so Lawrence Michel, he's an economist at the Economic Policy Institute, actually estimates the average wage once you take into account for maintenance and depreciation and putting gas in the car between $11 and $13 an hour. So this is definitely above the minimum wage in most cities, and it gives a lot of flexibility. So I'm still saying this tension that I'm sort of drawing out for you, all the nuance that Jerry is suggesting, is why I call this type of work a good, bad job. And if you're interested, I'll be talking about it tomorrow in this sort of choose your own adventure. But the good thing is that it really does offer choice and flexibility to people. Many of these drivers I interviewed could not find work through the traditional labor market, or if they had other reasons why the traditional labor market wasn't a fit for them. One of the person was going through chemo and needed more flexibility than what his traditional job in laying carpets could offer them. And this work offers it. And we often tend to think of this work as being completely controlled by algorithms. Maybe the work process is, but there is flexibility somewhat in choosing what time you want to start and when do you want to go home and what areas you may or may not want to pick up passengers in. But that flexibility is circumscribed. So I call that contingent autonomy. Because yes, you have flexibility if you're going to start at 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. But if you're really dependent on that income, you've got to be out when the surges are. This is something I experienced, particularly when I rented a car through an agency and I had these very high payments to make. Like, the surge starts at 5 a.m. I've got to be out there. So the flexibility is really sort of limited. But I say the good things about this job is it's sort of giving work to people that are having a harder time finding work, and they do have some flexibility or more flexibility in what they can find traditional unemployment. And then bad aspects is that there's choice and flexibility, but ultimately not autonomy or true freedom. And I call these sort of pain points that people are going to have when I'm driving. I don't get a chance to really go into this right now, but Carrie will talk about sort of what work is like when people have low wages, particularly wages that sort of vary up and route. There's sort of, if people are kicked off the platform, there's very opaque ways about how they try to can they get back on the platform if they're kicked off. In some places, actually impossible. And they have to deal with customers, which I know are often very rude, but I know that's none of us in the room. So I've gone way over time. You can tell I love talking about this, but I'll stop for right now.
Okay, do you want me to just start? Hi, I don't necessarily study people in the gig economy. I study all kinds of people in the economy, but I do focus on financial precarity. And what I mean by that is having a persistent worry about paying the bills, a persistent worry about money, that it's always on your mind. And because of labor market changes and the social norms that go along with that, I think that precarity has become democratized. And usually when we talk about democracy, we think that is a really good thing. In this case, I think not so much. And what I mean by it being democratized is that larger swaths of the population are really very precarious. We've always had the poor have always been with us, but now what we see is also people that were traditionally middle class also being worried about money a lot. Even people that are upper middle class being worried about money a lot. So it's no longer just a small subset of workers in the US at least, nor is it a certain status of workers, but rather it includes a lot of people in that bucket. It's Uber drivers, it's delivery drivers, but it's also doctors. We're doing a study now with physicians. I think the strong message to all workers, whether you're a quote regular employee or whether you're an Uber driver, is that you're on your own. That things I think have changed dramatically in that regard. So let me tell you a couple of things about the financial state of the union. One is that 80% of us live paycheck to paycheck, 80% of us. And I think the best evidence of that was when we had the government shutdown, remember last year? And these were people that were in middle class and upper middle class jobs, and they were scrambling to pay their rent. 75% of us don't save $100 a month. So only 25% of us save that much. 75% of us are in debt. Half of us think we'll be in debt all of our lives. And there's lots of other data on people struggling to pay just basic bills like medical bills, et cetera. So there's a lot of people that are very anxious about their economic circumstances. And the big problem with that, there's a lot of problems with it, but being anxious all the time is really stressful. And it has detrimental effects on health, on our physical health, on our psychological health, with depression, anxiety, fear, anger, lots of emotions, and also on our social health, that people tend to socially isolate when they're feeling under a lot of stress. So the punchline here, I guess, just descriptively, is that there's a lot of us that are financially precarious, and that the financially precarious are less happy, less healthy, and they die younger than those who are not precarious. The work I do, and there's lots of people that have done this kind of work, the work that I have been doing over the last couple of years looks at a different question. And that question is, what's the effect of financial precarity on employers or on organizations? And essentially what we find is that when people are worried about paying the bills, it hinders their ability to perform well at work. And the primary reason for that is kind of a cognitive bandwidth argument. It's an ability argument, not a motivation argument. That it's well established that we all have limited cognitive bandwidth. If part of that, perhaps a good part of that, is taken up with worried about how you're going to pay the bills, what are you going to do about the rent, how are you going to pay for childcare, et cetera, it leaves much less left over to focus on other things, like your job, for example. We've done a lot of different studies on this. One study that I'll talk about more tomorrow in my session is with truck drivers. And this was a study of about 1,200 truck drivers. And what's interesting about them is this is the middle class. These are people that were making $60,000 to $70,000 a year, yet a whole lot of them felt very precarious. And what we found is the more precarious they felt, the higher the probability of a preventable accident. We did a different study. We've done experimental studies to support this. We've done studies with healthcare workers. And what we find is they don't notice patient safety concerns as much. And it's not that they don't care. It's not that they're not motivated. It's they don't see them. And again, it's this cognitive bandwidth. When you have this much taken out because of this worry, you have problems. We also did a study with college students. And what we found is that SAT scores don't translate into grade point average for college freshmen that are worried about paying for college. That they do for other kids, they don't for kids that are worried about paying. So the punchline here is that when people are worried about their finances, it undermines their cognitive capacity, and as well as their emotional well-being, their health, their work performance. And I guess the further punchline there is that the disadvantaged become further disadvantaged. And again, remember, it's an ability argument, not a motivation argument. So what we try to do with our research is, for lack of a better way to put it, make this business case that it's in employers' interest to think about the financial well-being of their workforce. So if we see that financial precarity interferes with job performance, and it also is detrimental to health. Those are all costs to the employers. And to me, I guess what we focus on now is, what do you do about this? What can employers do about this? And tomorrow I'll talk a little bit more about that. One thing I said to Jerry at our table before we came up here, is I kind of see a bit of a pivot. What we saw, I think, from about mid-1990s on, is employers kind of extricating themselves from any kind of financial responsibility for their employees to the extent that they could. And the biggest example of that is the movement from defined benefit pensions to defined contribution pensions. Defined benefit pensions a generation ago were the most common kind of pensions. Now it's about 1% of the private sector workforce. So I kind of see companies pivoting back because they're seeing the cost of this, and I can give you lots of examples of that, and also talk about some interventions they've done. I don't have a lot of faith in at least the federal government to be doing much about this. You know, you think about, like, our great aspiration is to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. That would be $30,000 a year. And that's our aspiration. We're nowhere close to that. It's $725. It hasn't been raised in 11 years. So I'm not going to put a lot of eggs in that basket. But I do think there is a role at the state level. There's lots of interesting things happening. And also, again, in the private sector, I think a lot of companies are doing things. And this conference, I think, is one example of that. So with that, I'll stop.
Okay, I'm on. Okay, good. First of all, I want to say thank you for inviting me to be a part of this discussion. Thank you, Jerry. I'm proud to be here. I'm honored to be here. I'm an alumnus of this fine institution. My son actually goes to school here. He's a student here at Ross School of Business. So, you know, it's a big thrill. He's in Mexico now, by the way. I'm here. And I'm also humbled by the confluence of experience and expertise in the room. This is really a great discussion. Thank you for letting me participate. My name is Mike Bishop. I hope to bring to this conversation kind of a personal perspective. I'm a serial entrepreneur, as I was introduced. But I'm also co-president of a company called Ipsy US, which is a not-for-profit company here in Michigan. It's an association whose primary mission is to provide resources and advocacy for independent workers. I wanted to talk, if I could, real quickly out of the gate, the three issues that I'd like to take up. One is the influence of the independent workers. Two, the challenges that face the independent workers. And three, let's talk about solutions. We've heard some pretty crazy stuff. And I actually, reflecting on your comments, my cognitive bandwidth has been severely reduced over the years, and now it's making all the sense in the world to me. But who are independent contractors, and why are they influential? Why is this a force to be reckoned with? And the truth is, this is a very diverse group. We think of them probably in a very small window of who makes this group up, but it's a wide range of ages, skill levels, and compensations. They're known by multiple different names. We've all heard them: independent contractors, consultants, freelancers, self-employed, gig workers, entrepreneurs, one and all. They play a increasingly larger role in the 21st century economy as we face changes in this economy, global changes. And they also play a big role in the prosperity of this country, a very large role. And Azariah will tell you more about that in her comments. But today, millennials are made up of all different groups. 38% of them are millennials. 29% of folks like me, Gen X. 34% of the boomers participate in the independent workforce. And these aren't just people seeking non-meaningful work, I forgot how you put it, good, bad jobs, whatever they are. These are very meaningful jobs in many cases. These are stay-at-home dads, part-time mothers, college students, students that are looking for ways to pay off certain debt. 40% of independent workers have college degrees or higher. And statistically, they have a higher earning potential than those in a traditional 9-to-5 job. Another thing that I like to point out to folks is that independent workers tend to be more civically engaged as well. 19% more politically active compared to workers at conventional full-time areas of employment. And 80% of those independent workers voted in the last midterm election. So influential, indeed. And if you're an elected official, these are numbers that you got to know, because this is a force to be reckoned with, and it's going to get bigger in the future. Today, 50 million Americans plus pursue independent work. The freedom, the independence to go out and do what you want, where you want, when you want, to provide for your family. And that group will continue to grow, and their influence will continue to grow. Now, there are challenges. We've heard about the challenges already today. Financial, precarious is not even the word. You feel every day that pressure on you as an independent worker. There's no question about it. Income volatility, income predictability, all issues that face the independent worker every day. And we all know that independent workers are not afforded the same kind of support and traditional employees would have. A safety net that allows them to rely on support when they need it the most. They also don't have a unified political voice. They're overtaxed. They're underrepresented. And every day they face overwhelming bias and intimidation by the system today. Now, some of the things that they don't get as a traditional employer would have are unemployment insurance, workers' comp, employer-sponsored retirement, group-rated health insurance, protection afforded to by anti-discrimination laws. They don't have paid vacations, holidays, or sick leave. They don't get maternity or paternity leave. And of course, they don't get severance pay. We all know that. These are things that traditional employees get every day. And they're just examples of the many things beyond the financial precarity that they feel every day. But for those who choose to be independent, today's modern workforce has a growing number of solutions, and they're both provided at the private sector level and the public sector level. And it's getting more and more on the private sector. And some of these solutions are real, some of them are effective, some of them are counterproductive, some of them are very new in their infancy and are growing. But as our global economy continues to evolve, we're seeing solutions to these challenges, most importantly by the private sector. And that's where we come along. Ipsy and iWorker provide those kind of solutions for independent contractors who feel abandoned or at least very lonely in this world. We specialize in providing bundled portable benefit packages customized for independent workers and a national advocacy program. And it's getting bigger and bigger every day. Ipsy members have access to fairly priced group benefits, financial planning tools, discounts on professional supplies and services, educational and career development opportunities, student loan assistance. We take all the independent workers' pain points and provide a solution in one portable bundle. This is something that I wish I had known a long, long time ago. And we also provide a very powerful voice for independent workers at the national level, because part of the solution is also public. And we've heard about AB5 earlier. But you know, if you're an independent worker, the last thing in the world you want to do is get a call from the IRS, for example. You don't want that call. Talk about being naked and afraid. This is a call that you don't want to take. If you're in a business and you utilize independent workers, you don't want to get that call either. That's because we're looked at differently. And we continue to be, the bias is still there, ingrained in our system. And it's because back in the 1919s, when Henry Ford decided to have a $5 workday, it changed our economy entirely. Everything moved to an employer-based system. And we have spent 100 years developing that and done a great job. But with this growing economy, things change. Independent workers have now come around, and it's a new world that we live in. And as we do that, governments at all levels, state and federal, are trying to figure out solutions for these independent workers to protect them. AB5, in my opinion, was was passed for that reason. But all it did was put pressure on 300 different sectors of the California economy. Oh, the California's own independent research policy committee said that 1 million independent contractors in California are impacted by this law. And since then, this has only been enacted since January of this year. Since then, 30 bills have been introduced in the California legislature to try to either repeal it or walk it back. So this is a real problem in California. And I would just say that other states, despite all these problems, are trying to adopt this proposal around the country. And the federal government, just in January, passed the PRO Act, which is AB 5 at the national level. So we have a huge disconnect between independent workers and the government trying to create a solution. I think everybody wants to do the right thing. We just need to talk to each other. And that's why we're here to help advocate for those folks. So very influential, lots of challenges, but a whole lot of solutions.
Thanks, Mike. So interesting story. Thank you all for being here, by the way. We're very excited about what we get to do. I mean, we are part of a movement that we fully and true-heartedly believe is changing history. We believe this movement will be in the history books. And the way it started for us was back in 2016, Dr. Carl Camden, the former CEO of Kelly Services, was very passionate about the world of independent work. And he knew that something had to be done. And so when I tease him, they call him Dr. Camden, because back in the day that was not appropriate. So I reiterated that it's now Dr. Camden again. When he retired, he knew that he had to do something about it. And so Kelly Services, when he left, they said, do something about this. Do something about this. We want you to continue the work that you're doing. Prior to that, though, we had this policy conference in 2016. And honestly, we thought maybe 40 people would show up. This is in Washington, D.C. We had 150 in standing room only. It was very overwhelming, the response. And what we learned very quickly was that everybody was wondering, what do we do about this growing workforce? And everybody realized there's something we have to do to change or die, right? And so that's why we're here today. But to explain to you very quickly what Ipsy and iWorker are, because those are probably names of companies and association you've never heard of. Ipsy originally started as the Association of Independent Workers. It's a model that we developed for independent workers in America to do all of the things that Mike listed. The problem is of course, in America, there's a lot of red tape around a bunch of different things, including insurance products and services. So what we had to do is separate the two entities. So iWorker Innovations is actually the service provider for Ipsy, the association. So that's where I come into play. So we have all of these services and offerings that we've created to fuel Ipsy, the association, which creates access to independent workers so they can have an equal voice and equal access to all the different products and services that employees would have. So as Mike mentioned, there are lots of challenges. Yes, we agree with that, which is why we are working on both the policy side as well as the business side. At the end of the day, what happened at the policy conference in 2017, February of 2017, was we had all of these things we talked about. We realized the independent workforce was growing rapidly. We have to do something about this. And so we were basically kind of called out on it. Well, what are you going to do about it? And we're like, that's a great question. So, we took up the challenge and here we are. And I mean, it's just been a whirlwind since then. It's just been amazing, the response that we've gotten, so many companies and people that we've worked with that are excited to embrace this movement. Some of the challenges, though, that Mike mentioned, I'd like to reiterate one of them, because we are doing something about it, and there is access to certain programs that are helping these independent workers. And by the way, the average income for the independent worker is about $68,000 to $70,000 a year. That's average. And it's not just drivers. As Lindsey mentioned, those people that work on platform services, they're given a lot of attention because it's in the media the most. But to be honest with you, I work with a lot of very, very talented scientists that are working in pharmaceutical companies. I work with a lot of talented technologists that are creating latest and most recent technologies. It's not just drivers. This economy is huge, and it's these people who choose to work the way that they want to work for a reason. It takes me back to in my early 20s, which was like 5 or 6 years ago. Hey, I was telling somebody in the hallway, I was asked to help coach this young girls soccer team, and these young ladies were 12 to 13. And I remember this one girl, she turned around and I was telling her to do her drills, and she's like, "You're not the boss of me." And I was like, "No, I'm not." But now that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a generation of people who are like, "You're not my boss." No, we're not. And we're glad we're not, because you're doing amazing things. So keep doing those things. One of the challenges, though, is finances and financial well-being. Interestingly, the study on doctors, we work with an organization called NALTO, which is the National Local Tenants. It's physicians, anesthesiologists, anybody who works in medical, but they work independently. You know the number one challenge they have? Financial wellness and understanding. Are you shocked? I was. I really was. These are genius people. They don't know how to manage money and they ask for help. So we've done something about that. We work with companies like Prudential, the insurance company of America, and we also work with a company locally here called GreenPath. And we provide tools and resources to help them understand how to manage their finances, the student loan repayment process and plans and things like that. We also bring into the company. This workforce brings approximately 1.3 to roughly $2.4 trillion of GDP into the US economy. It's influential. They're making shifts, they're making changes. So the opportunity here is business. What are you doing in the business world to adapt and to change? How can we create new programs, create new accesses, processes, policies, and practices within our businesses to help adapt and mold to this workforce? The influence of the independent workers, I would argue, and Dr. Carl Camden would say that the interesting social experiment of the employment world for the past 70 years has now come to an end. And I would say where business once determined how a worker worked, now we live in a time where perhaps we could argue the workers are determining how businesses are being run. I think it's a fair argument. It's one I'm worth having because the independent workforce represents approximately the estimates are between 52 and 68 million people in the United States. 22 million of those people are estimated to work this way full time. By the way, recent estimates, some research, not all consistent, 60% of Uber drivers work less than 10 hours. So I don't want people to get the false idea that this is a horrible thing. These people are excited to be living the way that they're living and excited to work the way they work. We want to have that energy and that enthusiasm. So moving on to some of the solutions, I'll give another example of some of the things that we're doing in terms of influence. I'm working currently with the University of Central Florida on a different grant. The University of Central Florida is a very influential and making a lot of progress by way of trying to understand this workforce. You know why? They're very closely tied to a very large entertainment industry with a mouse, if you can think of the name of that. They have some problems though. They realize we've got to adapt because we need workers and we don't know how to get to them. Here's the reality. For example, if they were to build a new water park, just hypothetically this were to happen, they have no qualms about the success of this water park. You know what they can't do? They can't figure out how they're going to get 400 lifeguards. How do you go find 400 lifeguards? The reality is they know they have to go to them. They're not coming to them anymore. They have to find them. And these people don't necessarily want to work a 9 to 5. They want to have flexibility and choice. So they're adapting and they're changing. So in terms of solutions and guidance, Mike mentioned we have solutions, but one of the things I will say that we find ourselves doing, and this is an interesting time we're in, we don't have all the answers and nobody's afraid to say that. We don't have the answers right now, but we're working to find them. And the difference is we're not just talking about it, we are doing something about it. And this workforce, of course, is responding. So one of the things that we've done and we find ourselves doing, and I, not even 2 weeks ago, found myself inside of a Fortune 50 company, and they're asking the same questions regarding a plan that they have for the next 10 years. What are we going to do about this workforce? We know we have to change. We know that we're going to have to change our business models. We know that this is coming. What do we do? And so what we often find is we're also giving a lot of guidance to these companies and organizations. Corporate social responsibility is very important to these companies, and they want to do the right thing. They're not trying to harm people. They're trying to operate businesses that the world has changed before their eyes, and so they're trying to understand what do we do differently. So we actually spend a lot of time on the Ipsy and iWorker side collectively. We spend a lot of time in consulting with different businesses and trying to help them understand maybe what are you doing wrong? What could you do differently? What are the misclassification risks? How can we mitigate those risks? There are a lot of things that are being done, and this is a very positive movement. And again, these people are very excited for the most part to be working the way that they work. So I would say, and I would challenge the previous conversation, and I'm curious where your guys' thoughts are on this. What I would argue right now is what you see between Ipsy and iWorker is we're actually doing what people are trying to figure out how to do. We have the policy and research side of the house, and then we have the business side of the house. And it's funny and laughable at times because we often talk in language that is very academic or legal sounding, and we're often challenged with, what does that mean? We are in the same position right now where we're trying to bring this language to people who understand it and who want to engage in it. We're all in the same thing together, but this workforce is not going away. So I guess I would ask, how engaged are you in the gig economy, and have you thought about the changes and the shifts that are affecting and influencing our day-to-day lives? Thank you.
Give you all a minute if you have any immediate reactions to what else you heard. Then I'll ask a provocative question. We'll have some more questions from folks in the room. So any thoughts about what you just heard from the rest of the panel?
I think there's different, oh, this sounds more echoey than it was before. But listening to Michael and Azariah talk, so you know how there are different segments, of course, of the gig economy, and how we often sort of concentrate on what's biggest in the media, like the Uber drivers, but there is a different segment of workers at the high end. So it's a question of sort of like where, it's like a very nuanced argument of like what's the right group that you're supposed to be talking about and that you're trying to understand more. And then I really love the question that you ended us with. You know, what are our ethical responsibilities of being a consumer of this type of product? It's something I often think about because I use Uber Eats, and maybe it's coming from a ghost kitchen and all of that.
It seems to me that one of the issues here is who's in the driver's seat, who's in control, that with the locums physicians you're talking about, that's probably a choice they made. With the Uber drivers you study, maybe not. And a lot of it, I think, is tied up with how precarious, you know, are you comfortable with the uncertainty, or is the uncertainty something that you just have to live with and would prefer not to? And I think that probably does make a difference in terms of the services and programs, et cetera, that you guys do.
It absolutely does.
I, as a entrepreneur myself and an independent business owner, I benefit from hearing this conversation. So I'm glad that I'm here because it really makes a difference to hear someone's perspective, especially someone who's studied it and has experience in the field. So that's my takeaway. I feel like I've learned something here today. I also think we live in a world where it's ugly sometimes because we really have to survive. And we heard that it used to be defined benefits was the solution, and now we're defined contributions, and there's a reason for that. And that's because employees are expensive, and we are what employers look at, the first thing they look at when they talk about having to address cost pressure. So as we saw with the eventuality of getting rid of defined benefits, so will we see the next phase of this, other machinations in the employment world where employees are given different status, and perhaps employers utilize independent contractors more because they are 30% less of a cost to an employer than an employee. And I don't, maybe that is dark, but it's a reality. The momentum is moving us in that direction. And it's time for all of us to see that train coming. Sorry.
Go ahead, you're good.
All right, I was going to ask my one crazy question. So this is, we just had a Super Tuesday recently. I don't know if you were paying attention, the Canadians. Today is Entirely Adequate Thursday. Just going to tone down perceptions about days of the week with Adequate Thursday. But imagine my son's dream world, which is a Sanders administration with a majority in the House and the Senate, and within weeks, the US turns into Denmark. Everyone has health insurance. Everyone has unemployment benefits. College is cheap. Bankruptcy laws are reasonable. And anyone that wants to start a business or be an independent contractor all of their basic social welfare needs are accounted for, because that's the job of the government. And so if I start a business making cupcakes for millennials and it fails, no harm, no foul, everybody gets unemployment insurance and they go back and train to code SQL and Python or whatever it is that they do next. And so this is sort of one political idea. Now that feels like that would be a bad news for iWorker, but would the US turning into Denmark under a Sanders administration, would this make the gig economy be this magical world where you could try out different things, control your own schedule, and have control over your life? Or would it be a nightmarish hell with the Venezuelan-style government with its foot on your neck?
No, I think that would just bring up different issues. I'm just starting a project now where I'm comparing drivers in North America, Africa, and the UK, the more democratic socialist countries. And here are all the dialogue around ride-hailing drivers, around misclassification, and should they be contractors or W-2? But in Europe, the questions are much more around taxation. Mm-hmm. And are these companies paying their fair share, and are the drivers buying into the system in the same way? And in Africa, my data is most drivers don't own their own cars in Africa. They rent them through a third party. That happens in the United States, but to a much lesser extent. So then it's more they have problems with the middleman with this, who owns this car, and is the car up to date? Do they actually have insurance? So I think if we did become to Denmark, we would just have a different set of problems that the gig economy would raise.
Let's go for it.
We live in a world and an economy that's got 23 trillion in debt. That's my biggest concern about that scenario, because in order to run a government that's built around that mindset, you'd have to drive that up substantially. And I worry about debt in this country. I worry about my kids and future generations. That would be my primary concern, among a litany of other concerns that I would have in that scenario.
Well phrased. Thank you very much. We have a couple of questions here. Yes, Justin Earl Bacu.
So I'll, I guess, make just a couple comments. I'll instead of taking a question, I'll just, because I work on this issue primarily, and I agree with Lindsey, I think the segmentation matters greatly when it comes to independent workers. Have many friends who have gone to find business schools like this and worked at McKinsey, and they're independent contractors and they're just fine. We don't worry about them. But the reality is, for the marginalized workers, a couple of comments. One on AB5, I think that even the early results are clear that it was not perfectly written, probably like a lot of legislation. I would think what's almost as equally telling, though, is that Uber, Lyft, and Grubhub dedicated $100 million to repealing it. $100 million. Why? Because they see it as a cost of doing business in maintaining the status quo. Now, what's the status quo for the marginalized workers? And I liked your myths that you posed. And like you, I did my own driving to gather my own data. And you mentioned a nice, Michael, I liked your list of things that gig workers can be missing. But the number one thing that I found was minimum wage. Why do they not want them to be employees? Because they're not paying minimum wage right now. And in Massachusetts, where I drove, on average, I'd make about $10 an hour pre-tax, $7 after tax. And as Lindsey appropriately said, by that pay scale alone, the nature of it being supplemental is incredibly misleading, because if I need any money at all, I have to drive quite a bit. But where I'm focused mostly, because I think Mike, you and Azariah appropriately pointed out, there's a lot of different models here within this that all kind of get lumped together. My focus has been primarily on the platforms and what role the platform businesses play in all of this. I think the biggest thing you can say is they have a commoditizing effect on workforces. And the commoditizing effect is always to the detriment, as far as I can tell, of labor. Now, the Uber model is, very well known, and as Lindsey said, talked about from, publicly, and people are consumers. of it, so they kind of understand it. But what I would say is, even as you start to dive into other models where you'd think there's more highly skilled labor, so take Upwork, which is one of the largest platforms. If you evaluate their S1 when they went public, 99% of registered users on Upwork did not make $1 in the last year, 99%. So it's a system in which the platforms commoditize and the benefits accrue to a very, very small number of workers, even for upscale platforms. And the lower end ones, of course, we know, attract a lot of marginalized workers who are in the most precarious situations. So a couple of thoughts.
Very good. Jerry, I was going to mention, and I didn't have time to say it, but in terms of the platform, the drive share platforms, and they're spending $100 million to try to repeal that law in California. You should know that when that law was passed, at the last second, they added a bunch of different interest groups that were the physicians, the construction contractors, real estate agents, attorneys, accountants, private detectives, travel agents, and exempted them from the law because they had enough resources to pay the lobbyist to get exemptions. So I only mention that because, of course, people are going to spend money to try and get out of a law that changes the world entirely. And I would also say that the law does not require businesses to hire independent contractors who are reclassified as employees. So they're just out. It's interesting, you say you're protecting the independent worker, but you reclassify them and then, oh, we can't afford to hire them. We're done.
And I would add to that too, with the data, it's interesting because we're actually looking at a qualitative issue, at a phenomenon. We're experiencing a shift in the workforce, and yet we're set in a model where we continue to try to justify things like ROI and everything else with quantitative data. It's not possible right now. And I think that through the trajectory of time, we'll begin to see that. And for us, even in research, it's, as they mentioned earlier, it's got to be a willingness to do things differently. I will tell you the number one answer in the insurance industry and the association world, which are the two most archaic industries, I swear to you, especially in the insurance world, the number one answer I get all the time is, well, this is the way we've always done it. I'm like, great, let's do something different. It's hard to get them to try to shift away from what we've always done. And I think that's the challenge here too, from a social perspective, is we're being challenged to do something different. And it's qualitative, in my opinion.
Last question. This is a very subtle group. All right, then I guess thank you to our panel. That was fantastic. I learned a lot. I think we all did here. Thank you so much. We are back here tomorrow for breakfast, but for those of you that are still wide awake, those who haven't traveled from Belgium, let's say, if you have any energy left in you, the nearest bar is going to be Pizza House, which actually has an entirely respectable bar associated with it, 2 blocks that away on Church Street. There will not be any students there. You will be safe. So thank you for being here today. We'll see you bright and early tomorrow.